In this video, we're going to show you how you can create a workload with the manifests from a private Git repo and have it deployed to a remote cluster, in this case our demo EKS cluster, running in a completely separate security domain. And we'll wrap that workload with a GitOps based automation pipeline to ensure that whatever is changed in our Git repo is automatically reconciled back to our cluster. So let's first start with creating a couple of namespaces. We're going to deploy two applications. The first application, let's call it Tom. We're going to create a namespace called Tom, and we're going to go deploy it to our EKS cluster. And let's give that a couple of seconds to publish. So if you go look at our cluster here and look for this, we have our new namespace called Tom. Then we're going to deploy another namespace called Jerry. Let's publish that too. Same cluster. And that'll take another couple of seconds to be operationalized. So now we have two namespaces here on this cluster that we have access to, that we created, Tom and Jerry. And the next step is create a repo, because we want to pull the artifacts from our repo. So for that, I have this private Git repo, and I have a bunch of YAML files. In this particular example, we're going to create a workload based on this echo.yaml file. So first, let's create the repository. So for that, go under integrations and repository, and I've kind of pre-created this. I've configured this repository endpoint, and I'm using credentials. In this case, I'm using a personal access token to access it from my Git repo for authentication. Let's check if it can access this successfully, and the validation is successful, which means we configured our repository, which means the Rafay controller can reach this repository to retrieve artifacts, etc. Next, let's go and deploy an application. We're gonna create the first workload called Tom, and it's a YAML file. We're gonna pull this from our repository, and let's pick Tom as the namespace. And our repository is this, and our release thing is main. So let's put that in main. And the YAML file is sitting at echo.yaml. Let's just copy that and echo.yaml. And then we go deploy it to this cluster, and we publish it. So now what's happening is the controller is retrieving the artifacts, the YAML file in this case, from the configured Git repo, and is reconciling it with the downstream cluster that we had specified in our and as you can see here, it should be up and operational, and it's pulled this image. The pods are up, and everything is good. As you can see here, we had configured 7 replicas, and we have 7 pods here. So that's been properly configured. So now we have deployed this once, right? So now every time you decide to go make a change in your Git repo, and you want to change this manifest, it should, we want this to automatically get reconciled downstream to the clusters, right? So let's try and do that. But before that, let's create our second workload. Let's call this Jerry, and let's assume this is going to be a clone of the same thing. We're going to pull it from this repo, Jerry, and we're going to do the same thing here as before. And we're going to deploy it to the same cluster, just the other namespace, and publish it. And it'll pull the same images, and the 7 replicas will show up in a couple of seconds. So you see here, there are 7 replicas again in the Jerry namespace. Okay. So now we have the Tom workload running in the Tom namespace and Jerry in the Jerry namespace. So we're good now. But we've kind of operationalized this in just a couple of minutes. Now let's wrap this with automation so that it can be done automatically. So let's go to GitOps and pipelines, and let's create a pipeline called Tom and Jerry, and let's go create a stage. The first stage, we're gonna call it Tom, and we want to deploy the workload called Tom. Okay, and whatever changes are picked up from the Git repo by this pipeline will be reconciled for this workload. So that's our first stage. The second stage, I want to have an optional approval stage. You don't need this, you can run this continuously, but just to kind of show in this example, we're going to run this approval stage, and I'm going to add an approver called, I'm going to pick myself, demos at rafay.co, and I'm not going to change anything else, just that. And then we're going to add the third stage called Jerry. And here we're going to add this workload called Jerry, and save that. So now we have these stages, and this is a direct acyclic graph. When the trigger happens, it'll just run this in a sequence, one after another. But now we have to configure how and when this pipeline will be triggered. So let's go to that. We have two options here. The first option is a webhook. The second option is a cron job. The cron job is essentially ideal for environments where webhooks are not supported, and there'll be a timer that just runs and checks the repo, configured repo for changes. In our case, we'll go with a webhook, and just call it Tom and Jerry. And in our case, it's this Git repo in his GitHub. And if you remember, the file we care about is under the main revision branch, and then echo.yaml. We're not going to change anything else. We're going to hit save, and let's go and set our webhook. Configuring that just takes a couple of seconds. Let's go add a webhook. Let's put in the payload URL. Let's copy the secret, put that in there, add the webhook, and our webhook is configured. And we are done. Now this is by default, the pipeline is deactivated. So let's activate the pipeline so that now anytime something changes in the Git repo, this pipeline will run. Okay. So now day 2, we have decided that for both our Tom and Jerry applications, we do not want 7 replicas. So we want to go change that from 7 to maybe 2. Okay, so let's go change that 7 to 2 replicas, right? And for the purpose of simplicity here, I'm going to commit this directly to the main branch, but in real life, you would have a pull request, reviews by others, and then merge the branch. So let's commit it. Now we made this change. Now in theory, the webhook should have been received by this pipeline. As you can see here, the first stage is already complete, right? See if I go to my, and then it's waiting for me to approve this. So let's go look at this and go look at our namespace. And as you can see here, it's terminating some of the pods. The instructions from the Git repo have been already reconciled for this particular workload. And if you run this again, it probably would be all cleaned up, but still terminating, okay? And then if you approve the pipeline, the second stage, it'll move on to the next stage, and it'll take care of updating the Jerry workload as well. As you can see, that also has been done. And if you go in here, you'll see that some of these pods that are still running, they, as soon as the API server lands up terminating those pods, they'll be clean, and it'll come down to a low number of replicas as we had configured in our Git repo. So that's it. Setting up a pipeline using Rafay for this kind of automation. Just takes a couple of minutes to execute. And now let's go make sure that our pods are indeed fully reconciled. Yeah, so now, as you can see, this is now running 2 pods. And if I go and look at the other workload called Jerry, and let's see if this has been completely reconciled. Yes, it's been reconciled. And now let's do it again. Let's try and change it to now 4 replicas. So 2 to 4 replicas, and try it again. And let's see what happens to our pipeline here. And he's already received the signal. He's already taken care of the first workload. Let me approve it. And the second thing also will be taken care of in the next few seconds. As you can see, this was a message we sent, and we are done. And if we go to our cluster and look for our replicas, we should now have 4. And as you can see, 2 of them are brand new. And then if we try the second one, again, we notice 2 of them are brand new. Well, thank you for watching.